Okay, so as far as we know, only about 2 of the 40 or so released PlayStation 5 games are actually exclusive to the console, as of the recording of this video that is, with one of them being an almost one-for-one remake of a PlayStation 3 exclusive, and the other being a shorter game that comes with the console. And despite arguably getting the better versions of those other 38 or so games, some PS5 owners have brought up some understandable arguments about how this practice, when applied to the first-party games, such as Miles Morales, not only affects them, but the overall product as well. Arguments that I will be refuting today as a PS4 owner who's just too poor. Can you fucking hear that? There's some kid across the fucking street playing the drums. What the fuck? It's 7 a.m. There's specifically one argument I want to focus on, arguably the most significant one. Now, I saw this point brought up by both Chris Raygun and Colin Moriarty on their PlayStation podcast Sacred Symbols. Specifically, Colin brought up the idea that having these games released on PS4 is holding back developers and what their games can do on the PlayStation 5's hardware. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it very, very clear that I am a fan of Colin, Chris, and their various respective works. Now, with that being said, I really don't agree with this point. In retrospect, over the past 7 years, early PS4 titles could have definitely been released on PS3 if the time and energy was put into optimization. However, possibly because of the PlayStation 3's architecture and the possibility of this new console's power, that was far less of a viable option, one that probably wouldn't have worked out in the end. I mean, imagine Ratchet & Clank or Second Son on PlayStation 3. Good gosh. But that didn't stop third-party developers from supporting it up until its discontinuation. They weren't always the best, sometimes they weren't even good, but they were playable enough, specifically for those who didn't see the worth yet in a next-gen system. And this practice pretty much extends to most other consoles in the modern age, except for Nintendo. Oopsie daisy, somebody made a fucky wucky. I forgot all about Breath of the Wild, so I guess Nintendo has done this practice once before. We can go back to as far as my memory goes, which is like Pro Skater 4 on PlayStation 1, but then there's Watch Dogs on Wii U, Phantom Pain on PlayStation 3, and Rise of the Tomb Raider on the 360. These were all games released after the new generation of consoles had arrived. Especially now during this piece of shit that is 2020, lots of people just aren't gonna get a new console. Even when the pandemic ends, God knows when, I think that a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X will be the last thing on certain demographics' minds, such as college students or families. And to be fair, both Chris and Colin brought this up. So yeah, ignoring third parties who will always do this practice regardless of quality, almost every single PS5 game will have a PS4 counterpart in one way or another for the next year or so. And despite that, I don't really think that it's technologically holding the developers back for the time being. Now, full disclosure. I have not worked in games, Colin Moriarty has. I have not worked in journalism, Colin has. So as a veteran in games journalism and the writer/creative lead for Lily Mo Games, he has a clear understanding of how the development process works that I don't. So instead of focusing on the process, I'm going to look at the results. And with that being said, I just really don't agree with this sentiment. For every single console, we can all agree that the first year is kind of the worst. The PS5 is one of the strongest launch lineups that I've seen in the past couple of years. But even then, time has shown that the first games compared to the final games of the generation are like night and day in terms of tech. Right now, a couple weeks after launch, the improvements from last gen are there, but they're kind of not worth $500 in my eyes, or $1,500 depending on where you look. The new hardware allows for more crowds, more enemies, better textures, which is all standard for a new generation at this point. 4K is cool. It's a great thing to experience firsthand, but as explained by Bob Wolf, that kind of can't be utilized to its full extent at this point thanks to televisions. Ray tracing does look amazing, but it almost feels like every game needs puddles or a shit ton of windows for it to be shown off at its full power. Plus, there's usually an option to turn that off and play at 60 frames per second for most games, which I'm always going to do. Granted, there is an SSD now compared to the standard hard disk drive, which is undeniably the biggest difference between the console releases due to the nature of the different tech. I believe this is called data streaming, something I know nothing about, so moving on. Point is, this is all great fucking tech, and I will be buying a PlayStation 5 in the future like everybody else. But as of right now, the fact is that the general consumer is going to keep their older consoles for a little while, especially since the last generation was the first time that there's been a significantly improved console just released halfway through its lifespan. The PS4 Pro and One X are only 4 and 3 years old respectively. and there is a shit ton of people who bought that as their new console. First-party developers are starting to appease these consumers by supporting them for a little while longer than usual. Now, there is a possibility that this has nothing to do with any of the stuff that I've mentioned, but even if this has nothing to do with COVID or the PS4 Pro, even if Sony just decided to do this on a whim, it's still a good thing with very few downsides to it. Pretty much, technology has gotten to the point where exclusive games can be dialed back in terms of resolution, frame rates, or textures, to the point where it can run on essentially last generation systems and still run well. Far gone are the days of downgrading a game to the point where it shouldn't even be on the fucking hardware. Both Miles Morales and Sackboy look amazing regardless of console, and eventually Horizon 2 and possibly even God of War Ragnarok will be on PS4 as well. But that doesn't mean that there won't be any exclusives, whether it be a timed release, a console exclusive that's also on PC, and even full-blown PS5 only games. You're going to get exclusives. Just because the biggest ones were released on last gen for a couple of years, that doesn't mean that we won't get those games only on PS5 that will show off the technical prowess of the next gen hardware. You are still going to get the graphical showcases, don't worry, they will still be there. In all honesty, I'm kind of surprised that this has become a bit of a common complaint, since this is essentially what Microsoft has been doing for a little bit with their Xbox brand. And while I'm not a huge fan of either company's business practices in the past, I think that this is a pretty good move for PlayStation. For the next couple of years, that is. To keep releasing these PS4 versions of these games would eventually become a little bit redundant. Sony has decided to take advantage of those who aren't upgrading to next gen just yet, which is a completely natural thing. I know that I've never been a day one buyer myself, neither is anybody else I know, so yeah, I am a little bit biased towards this practice. But that doesn't blind me to what could possibly come from having too much of a good thing. This whole cross-gen games thing has an end date for a reason. To keep porting these games to PS4, to keep this practice going on past 2022 or so, the argument of why upgrade to the PlayStation 5 will eventually have some ground. Pretty much, PlayStation 5 games on PS4 is a bit of a newer choice for Sony, but I think that it's one that is super pro-consumer and it's one that they've handled very well. Usually, Sony just ignores backwards compatibility now. They just remastered an old exclusive from their catalog and then just call it a day. But to reintroduce backwards compatibility and to introduce exclusives that come out on older hardware is a step in a pretty great direction, especially since the PS4 copies can then be played on the PlayStation 5 through the aforementioned backwards compatibility. So yeah, personally, I see very few downsides to this practice as long as it goes on for a short amount of time. Alright, that's pretty much all I got. I just want to state one last time that I'm not trying to make a big issue out of anything. I just wanted to state my opinion on this specific topic since I had an opposing opinion. Speaking of which, what do you guys think about cross-gen PlayStation 5 games? Tell me all about it down below. Anyways, like, subscribe, and all that jazz. I'll catch you guys next time. Later, kids. Have a good night.